This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. This introduction is for an analytical deep dive episode about the 1997 work 我々はなぜ戦争をしたのか, 米国ベトナム敵の対話, directed by Daisaku Higashi for NHK. Higashi, later a professor at Sophia University and a UN peacebuilding expert, structured this documentary around the historic 1997 Hanoi dialogue between American and Vietnamese former officials. The work remains critically urgent as a lens through which to examine the recurring tragedy of mutual ignorance in modern geopolitical conflicts. In this episode, we examine the work through the clash of American technocratic logic versus Vietnamese historical memory, the role of media and dialogue in reconciling incompatible histories, and the haunting parallels this argument without end holds for contemporary superpower confrontations. Even if you are familiar with the Vietnam War, we invite you to set aside the conventional narratives and listen anew to this profound study of how two civilizations can fight the same war in completely different realities. Chapter 1. McNamara's Confession, Origins of the Hanoi Dialogue. The inception of the Hanoi dialogue is fundamentally inseparable from the psychological and intellectual trajectory of Robert McNamara, the man who served as the primary architect of American involvement in Vietnam under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. To understand why this dialogue happened in June 1997, one must first analyze the seismic shift in McNamara's public persona that occurred 2 years earlier. In April 1995, McNamara published his memoir, In Retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. Within its pages lay a sentence that would shatter the silence he had maintained for nearly 3 decades. We were wrong, terribly wrong. This was not merely a historical correction, it was a secular confession that triggered a violent reaction across the American political spectrum. Mainstream interpretations often frame this memoir as a courageous act of late-life moral reckoning, a tragic hero finally facing the ghosts of his past. However, an intellectual historical reading suggests a more complex motivation. McNamara, the quintessential whiz-kid and technocrat, was perhaps less interested in moral penance than in systemic diagnostic. His use of the phrase, terribly wrong, functioned as an admission of a logic failure. For a man who believed that any problem could be solved with enough data and the right spreadsheets, the failure of the Vietnam War was a glitch in the grand machine of American policy. The memoir was his attempt to find where the calculation had deviated. This psychological drive for a post-mortem analysis collided with the geopolitical realities of a post-Cold War world. By the mid-1990s, the United States and Vietnam were inching toward normalization of relations. In this context, McNamara's confession acted as a diplomatic lubricant. While the American public was embroiled in McNamara bashing, accusing him of either being a war criminal or a traitor, depending on their ideological leaning, the Vietnamese leadership viewed the book through a strictly pragmatic lens. For Hanoi, McNamara's admission was interpreted as a formal, if indirect, apology from the highest levels of the former American establishment. It provided the necessary political cover for Vietnamese officials to sit across the table from their former enemies. This discrepancy in reception is critical. What the West saw as an individual's psychological crisis, the East saw as a state-level concession. Daisaku Higashi, the author and NHK director who would eventually bring this dialogue to the public, captures the atmospheric tension of this period. He notes that the dialogue, titled The Missed Opportunities Project, was not a spontaneous meeting, but a meticulously planned academic and diplomatic encounter. The very title, Missed Opportunities, reveals the structuralist framework through which McNamara viewed the conflict. It presupposes that war is a series of decision points where, had better information been available, a different path could have been taken. This mainstream American view treats war as an avoidable accident of communication. In contrast, the Vietnamese perspective, voiced by figures like Deputy Foreign Minister Tran Quang Co., often pushed back against this accidental framing. For the Vietnamese, the war was not a series of missed opportunities, but a necessary, inevitable struggle for national independence against foreign intervention. The conflict between these two frameworks, the American glitch in the system versus the Vietnamese historical necessity, formed the underlying friction of the entire genesis of the dialogue. The sociological dimension of the dialogue's start is best illustrated by McNamara's first visit to Hanoi in November 1995. This trip was the prerequisite for the 1997 conference. It was here that McNamara met General Vo Nguyen Giap, the legendary military strategist who had defeated both the French and the Americans. The historic handshake between these two men is a motif that recurs throughout the source documents, symbolizing the transition from combatants to interlocutors. It was during this 1995 encounter that one of the war's most pivotal myths was finally dismantled. McNamara and General Giap confirmed that the Second Tonkin Gulf incident of August 4, 1964, the very event that served as the primary catalyst for the U.S. Congress to authorize broad military action, never actually took place. For McNamara, hearing from the enemy commander that the reported torpedo attacks were non-existent was a staggering confirmation of his own burgeoning belief in the fallibility of American intelligence. Yet, even this symbolic gesture was fraught with hidden agendas. The Vietnamese Foreign Ministry, as revealed in interviews with Tran Quang Company, was acutely aware that engaging with McNamara could facilitate economic ties with the United States. Vietnam was desperate for domestic development and saw the strengthening of economic relations as the ultimate goal of the dialogue. Thus, while McNamara was chasing the lost logic of the 1960s, the Vietnamese were chasing the market logic of the 21st century. Higashi's own role as a curator of this history adds a formalist layer to the narrative. He was not present at the closed-door sessions in 1997, but he obtained 22 cassette tapes of the proceedings. The act of listening to these tapes, as he describes it, was an encounter with different civilizations. This is a crucial analytical point. The dialogue was not just between two nations, but between two fundamentally different ways of knowing. The American side, led by McNamara and a team of scholars like James Blight, relied on a massive archive of declassified documents. They brought two entire files of primary sources to the table, operating under the belief that the truth is contained in the written record of policy decisions. The Vietnamese side, conversely, refused to provide any internal documents, relying instead on the memory of the participants. This asymmetry created a unique discursive space, where the Americans were constantly testing hypotheses while the Vietnamese were asserting realities. A contrarian reading of this genesis might suggest that the Hanoi dialogue was, in fact, an act of intellectual colonization. By setting the agenda around the concept of missed opportunities, McNamara effectively forced the Vietnamese to debate the war on American terms. He defined the parameters of the discussion as a search for what went wrong in the decision-making process, thereby sidestepping the fundamental moral and ideological questions of the war's legitimacy. From this perspective, the dialogue was McNamara's final attempt to control the narrative of the war, transforming a crushing military and moral defeat into a shared tragic misunderstanding. He sought to refashion the image of the war from one of American aggression to one of mutual ignorance. This is the argument without end that the project eventually became known as, a shift from the hopeful missed opportunities to a more cynical acknowledgement that the two sides might never truly agree on why they fought. The logistical hurdles of the meeting also illuminate the internal divisions within both nations. On the American side, there was significant resistance from the military establishment. Many former officers and Pentagon officials refused to participate, viewing the dialogue as an exercise in self-flagellation. On the Vietnamese side, there was a similar reluctance among the hardline military hawks who saw no reason to re-examine a war they had clearly won. The participants who did show up were, in many ways, the doves or the pragmatists of their respective camps. This means the dialogue was not a representative sample of the two nations' leadership, but a conversation between specific factions who believed in the power of rational discourse. This choice of participants predetermined the civil tone of the meeting, but it also highlighted the fragility of the entire enterprise. When the 4-day non-public discussion finally began at the Metropole Hotel in Hanoi on June 20, 1997, it was the culmination of these intersecting psychological, economic, and intellectual forces. McNamara opened the proceedings with a focus on mindsets, the internal maps of reality that leaders use to interpret the world. He was obsessed with the domino theory and the American belief that the fall of Vietnam would lead to the collapse of all Southeast Asia into the communist sphere. He wanted to know if the Vietnamese had understood this American fear. The very structure of his opening gambit was a manifestation of the best and brightest ideology, the belief that if we can only understand the other side's goals and intentions, we can manage global conflict like a business merger. This intellectual framework, however, would immediately clash with the lived experience of the Vietnamese, who saw themselves not as a domino in a global game, but as a sovereign people fighting for their soil. The tension of this beginning was further heightened by the shadow of the dead. 3 million Vietnamese and 58,000 Americans had died in the conflict McNamara was now analyzing as a series of misunderstandings. For the Vietnamese participants, the weight of these casualties made the American focus on missed opportunities seem almost clinical, even heartless. This gap in emotional and historical stakes is a recurring theme in Higashi's reconstruction. He notes that for the Americans, the dialogue was a way to learn lessons for the future, whereas for the Vietnamese, it was a way to settle the accounts of the past. This fundamental difference in temporal orientation, looking forward versus looking back, meant that the two sides were often talking past each other from the very first hour. The asymmetry of information also played a vital role in the dialogue's early stages. The Americans had declassified their secrets, but the Vietnamese' secret-keeping ability, as Higashi calls it, remained intact. This created a dynamic where the Americans were transparent but defensive, while the Vietnamese were opaque but assertive. The American side wanted to verify their hypotheses against Vietnamese records, but they were met with silence or anecdotal evidence. This forced the dialogue into a realm of pure rhetoric and psychological interpretation, rather than historical verification. It was a genesis built on a foundation of one-sided transparency, a fact that would haunt the subsequent days of debate and lead to the startling revelations regarding the specific triggers of the war's escalation. Chapter 2. The Taxonomy of Failure, Divergent Lists, and Distrust. The concept of a missed opportunity is a retrospective construct that requires a specific intellectual posture. To speak of a missed opportunity is to believe that history is a series of branch points where a different choice, predicated on better information or a more rational mindset, could have averted a catastrophe. This was the fundamental premise that Robert McNamara brought to the Hanoi dialogue in 1997. He arrived with a taxonomy of 5 distinct possibilities for peace that he believed had been squandered between 1961 and 1968. The neutralization of South Vietnam, the maintenance of the No Din Dem regime, the pursuit of a decisive military victory, a total American withdrawal, and the success of various secret peace negotiations. However, the very act of listing these points revealed a profound structuralist bias. McNamara viewed the war as a problem of management and communication. If the mindsets of the leaders had been aligned, or if the signals sent through diplomatic channels had been clearer, the machinery of war could have been halted. This mainstream American interpretation, centered on the tragedy of mutual misunderstanding, was immediately challenged by the Vietnamese delegation. Tran Nguyen Co, the former first deputy foreign minister, presented an entirely different set of 4 missed opportunities that reached back to 1945. His list included Ho Chi Minh's 1945 letter to President Truman, the American violations of the 1954 Geneva Accords, the potential for neutralization in the early 1960s, and the failure of the Nixon administration to end the war in 1969. The gap between these two lists is not merely historical, but ontological. While McNamara focused on the 1960s as a period of tactical and communicative errors within a Cold War framework, the Vietnamese framed the entire 30-year period as a single, coherent struggle for national sovereignty. For Hanoi, the opportunity was not a diplomatic deal to be struck between two powers, but the simple recognition of their right to self-determination. The friction between these two worldviews was most visible in the Vietnamese refusal to even entertain McNamara's third point, the possibility of a decisive U.S. military victory. To the Vietnamese delegation, the idea that the United States could have won the war through different military applications was not a historical opportunity, but a delusion. They viewed their victory as an inevitability, dictated by the nature of a people's war, a perspective anchored in the legacy of the 1968 Tet Offensive. Although the offensive resulted in a severe military setback for the North Vietnamese forces on the ground, it functioned as a decisive psychological turning point that shifted American public opinion irrevocably against the war. By shattering the American domestic consensus, the offensive demonstrated that traditional military metrics were secondary to the political and psychological will to endure, rendering McNamara's tactical counterfactuals irrelevant to the actual experience of the conflict. Similarly, the debate over the 1969 opportunity remained stunted. Tran Quang County argued that the Nixon administration had missed a clear chance to exit the war early, but this point could not be fully debated because the American delegation lacked actual participants from the Nixon administration who could speak to the internal logic of that period. A psychological framework is essential to analyze the debate over the neutralization of South Vietnam, which occupied much of the second day of the dialogue. This proposal sought to apply the model of the 1962 Geneva Accords on Laos, which had established a coalition government and a neutral status for that country, to the conflict in Vietnam. The dialogue on this point became a microcosm of the entire war's friction. Lưu Duan Huinh, a veteran diplomat and scholar, argued that the Vietnamese side had genuinely hoped for neutralization as a way to avoid a full-scale American intervention. In response, Chester Cooper, a former CIA official and member of the American delegation, launched a sharp rebuttal. He argued that the United States had lost all faith in neutralization because they believed the North Vietnamese had violated the Laos Agreement by leaving troops behind. This exchange highlights the vicious cycle of distrust that characterizes the sociological dimension of the conflict. Each side interpreted the other's actions through a lens of inherent bad faith. The Americans saw neutralization as a communist tactic to gain time, while the Vietnamese saw the American refusal as proof of a strategy for permanent imperialist occupation. This cycle was exacerbated by the composition of the dialogue itself. The Vietnamese delegation at the Metropole Hotel was composed of representatives from the North. Yet the war had involved 3 distinct Vietnamese entities: the North Vietnamese government, the National Liberation Front, NLF, in the south, and the Saigon government. The absence of the NLF and the Saigon administration from the 1997 table mirrored their marginalization during the war's most critical diplomatic turning points, where the Americans often attempted to negotiate the fate of the South without the full participation of the indigenous forces they were either fighting or supporting. The structuralist failure of the American punishment logic was further explored in the dialogue concerning secret peace negotiations, specifically the Marigold Initiative of 1966 and the Sunflower Proposal of 1967. McNamara and the Americans viewed these as genuine missed opportunities where the North Vietnamese had been unreasonable or stubborn. However, the Vietnamese provided a concrete counter-narrative. Nguyen County Thoc, who served as deputy foreign minister during the conflict, was identified as the key figure who made the decision to terminate the Marigold talks. He clarified that the termination was not due to a missed signal or a lack of interest in peace, but was a direct response to the American decision to resume the bombing of Hanoi. For the Vietnamese, the American strategy of using bombing as a bargaining chip was a fundamental misunderstanding of their political culture. To negotiate while being bombed was viewed not as a rational choice, but as an act of submission that would compromise national dignity. This disconnect was fostered in the insular environment of the Tuesday lunch meetings, where high-level strategy was often forged in a vacuum of cultural expertise. The American delegation's reliance on top-down, centralized command and control frameworks led them to interpret every event as a strategic signal from Hanoi. The Pleiku incident of 1965 stands as a pivotal moment where tactical actions were misread as strategic signals. During the dialogue, Vietnamese General Dong Vu Hiep provided a startling clarification that dismantled decades of American assumptions. He testified that the attack on the U.S. base had been an unauthorized decision made by a local commander on the ground, rather than a calculated provocation ordered by the leadership in Hanoi. This failure of perception ignored the decentralized sociological reality of the Vietnamese struggle. The most striking evidence of this decentralization was the Long Hair Army in Ben Tre Province. In 1965, 5,000 women wearing mourning bands to protest the brutality of the local regime organized a spontaneous, bottom-up resistance that caught even the communist leadership by surprise. This movement was a manifestation of indigenous, local grievances rather than a directive from a central headquarters. By projecting their own bureaucratic hierarchy onto a guerrilla movement, the United States interpreted local tactical initiatives as global strategic gambits. They were fighting an industrial war against an agricultural society, and they lacked the sociological tools to see that the resistance was often driven by decentralized autonomous units rather than a monolithic command structure. The divergent perceptions of these key incidents show that the two sides were not just fighting over territory, but over the very meaning of history. While the Americans sought to identify the specific data points where the machinery of diplomacy failed, the Vietnamese emphasized the balance of forces and the psychological necessity of resistance. This leads to a fundamental question. If the two sides were operating with such different definitions of what constituted an opportunity, was a diplomatic solution ever truly possible? Or were they destined to remain trapped in a cycle of mutual ignorance? Chapter 3. Tragic Revelation: The Price of Mutual Ignorance. The most unsettling discovery to emerge from the 4 days of the Hanoi dialogue was not a hidden treaty or a secret military order, but the sheer, staggering scale of mutual ignorance. Robert McNamara and his team of American scholars arrived in Hanoi operating under a specific psychological framework. They believed that the war was a series of logical failures that could be unpicked by identifying where the signals had been crossed. However, as the dialogue progressed, it became clear that the two sides were not just misreading signals, they were living in entirely different conceptual universes. This revelation forces a reevaluation of the best and brightest myth. A mainstream reading of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations often emphasizes their intellectual brilliance and technocratic competence, suggesting that their failure in Vietnam was a matter of being too smart for their own good. But the evidence from the 1997 tapes suggests a contrarian interpretation. These men were profoundly, almost pathologically, ignorant of the cultural, historical, and sociological realities of the people they were fighting. This ignorance was most evident in the American obsession with the domino theory. To McNamara and the advisors who attended the Tuesday lunch meetings at the White House, Vietnam was never an end in itself. It was a square on a global chessboard, a mere function of the Cold War struggle between the United States and the monolithic bloc of the Soviet Union and China. This structuralist framework blinded them to the reality that the Vietnamese viewed their struggle through the lens of a 2,000-year history of resistance against foreign occupation, particularly against China. The Americans assumed that North Vietnam was a puppet of Moscow or Beijing, a premise that the Vietnamese participants in 1997 met with a mixture of amusement and indignation. Tran Quang County and Lu Dan Huang pointed out that Hanoi's primary goal was always national independence and reunification. They were willing to take aid from the Soviets and the Chinese, but they had no intention of becoming their subordinates. The American failure to distinguish between international communism and nationalist revolution was not a minor oversight. It was the foundational error that made every subsequent decision terribly wrong. The sociological dimension of this misunderstanding was rooted in the American inability to process the idea of a decentralized indigenous resistance. The planners in Washington projected their own bureaucratic, top-down command structures onto the Vietnamese peasantry, assuming that power must flow from a central headquarters. They believed that if they could only identify and destroy that headquarters, the elusive COSVN or the leadership in Hanoi, the resistance would collapse. They were fighting an industrial war against an agricultural society, and they lacked the sociological tools to see that the enemy was not an army, but a mobilized population. This technocratic detachment allowed for the deployment of weapons that targeted the very ecology of the nation. The American military's extensive use of Agent Orange and other defoliants, intended to deny the insurgency its natural cover, ignored the profound human cost of environmental destruction and the long-term health issues that would affect multiple generations of Vietnamese people. To the best and brightest, these were variables in an equation of attrition. To the Vietnamese, they were permanent scars on the national soul. This gap in understanding was not one-sided. The Vietnamese participants admitted to their own profound ignorance of the American mindset. They were largely unaware of the genuine fear that the domino theory instilled in American leaders. To the Vietnamese, the idea that their small, war-torn country could trigger the collapse of all Southeast Asia seemed like a bizarre American fantasy. Consequently, they interpreted every American move not as a defensive reaction to a perceived global threat, but as a calculated step in a grand plan for permanent imperialist occupation. They saw the United States as simply the new France, a successor to the colonial power they had just defeated. This psychological mirror imaging meant that both sides attributed to the other a level of strategic clarity and malevolent intent that simply did not exist. The Americans saw a global conspiracy where there was a local revolution. The Vietnamese saw a colonial empire where there was a paranoid superpower. The structuralist failure of the American decision-making process is best illustrated by the Tuesday lunch meeting motif. These sessions, where the most critical escalatory decisions were made, were characterized by an extreme form of intellectual insularity. The source documents reveal that experts on Vietnamese history, language, and culture were systematically excluded from these high-level discussions. The decisions were made by a small circle of men who shared the same educational background, the same Cold War assumptions, and the same technocratic faith in data. This created a sociological echo chamber where the domino theory was never questioned because everyone in the room already believed it. When McNamara asked the Vietnamese in 1997 why they hadn't understood American intentions, he was met with the sobering reality that his own government had never made an effort to understand theirs. The best and brightest were victims of their own brilliance, believing that their sophisticated models of crisis management and escalation ladders were universal truths that applied as much to the jungles of Southeast Asia as they did to the corridors of the Pentagon. The formalist analysis of the language used during the 1997 dialogue further reveals this communicative abyss. A recurring point of friction was the definition of negotiation. For the Americans, negotiation was a process of bargaining and concession, a business transaction where both sides trade points to reach a middle ground. For the Vietnamese, however, the term was often synonymous with tactics or discussion aimed at securing the fundamental goal of independence. This was not a mere linguistic hurdle, it was a clash of political cultures. The Americans were looking for a deal that would preserve the status quo, while the Vietnamese were engaged in a struggle that could only end with the transformation of the status quo. This difference was most painfully clear in the American use of bombing as a bargaining chip. McNamara and his colleagues genuinely believed that by increasing the cost of the war through aerial bombardment, they were providing the Vietnamese with a rational incentive to negotiate. They viewed the bombing as a tool of communication. From the Vietnamese perspective, however, this was not communication, but extortion. To negotiate while being bombed was to accept the role of a victim, submitting to a criminal. The more the Americans bombed, the more the Vietnamese felt they had to resist to maintain their national dignity. The punishment logic of the best and brightest was psychologically illiterate. It failed to account for the fact that for a people fighting for their very existence, the cost of the war is irrelevant compared to the cost of surrender. This cost was not merely measured in casualties, but in the enduring devastation of the landscape through chemical warfare, a reality that the American models of rational escalation were fundamentally unequipped to value. The most tragic revelation of the dialogue occurred on the final day, during a discussion of the minimum conditions for peace. McNamara recounted a moment of epiphany he had the night before last while reviewing the notes from the session. He realized that the minimum conditions the United States was seeking in the mid-1960s, a neutral South Vietnam that was not a base for foreign troops, were actually compatible with the minimum conditions the North Vietnamese would have accepted at that time. For 30 years, McNamara had lived with the assumption that the two sides' goals were fundamentally irreconcilable. The discovery that a diplomatic solution might have been possible as early as 1962 or 1964, had the two sides simply understood each other's bottom lines, was a moment of profound psychological devastation. It suggested that the deaths of millions were not the result of a necessary conflict between two incompatible ideologies, but the result of a massive, avoidable failure of human intelligence. This epiphany, however, remains a point of contention. While McNamara saw it as proof of a missed opportunity, the Vietnamese participants were more skeptical. They argued that minimum conditions are not static data points. They are shaped by the balance of forces and the psychological state of the combatants. Even if the conditions were technically compatible on paper, the vicious cycle of distrust made it impossible for either side to believe the other would honor them. The Americans didn't trust the North to stay out of the South, and the North didn't trust the Americans to ever truly leave. This sociological reality suggests that knowledge is not just about having the right information. It's about having the trust necessary to act on that information. The Hanoi dialogue revealed that, in the absence of such trust, even the most brilliant leaders are effectively blind, stumbling into a darkness of their own making. The 1997 meeting ended not with a consensus on history, but with a shared acknowledgement of the tragedy of that blindness. The tapes capture a sense of exhaustion among the participants, as if the weight of the missed opportunities and the terribly wrong decisions had finally caught up with them. They had spent 4 days peeling back the layers of their own ignorance, only to find a core of unresolved grief and lingering suspicion. The dialogue proved that while it is possible to sit across the table from a former enemy and analyze the logic of a war, it is much harder to bridge the civilizational gap that allowed the war to happen in the first place. The revelation of mutual ignorance was not a resolution, but a confrontation with the limits of human reason in the face of ideological and cultural pride. This confrontation with the past set the stage for the final, most difficult task of the dialogue, the attempt to move beyond blame and find a path toward genuine reconciliation. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Dialogue, Memory, Data, and the Metropole. The 1997 Hanoi Dialogue was a public act of historical reconstruction, a process facilitated by the lens of the media and the specific role of Daisaku Higashi. As a director for an NHK special, Higashi did not merely document the meeting, he helped curate a space where the public could witness the grueling process of reconciliation. This media context is essential for understanding the dialogue as more than a private academic exchange. It was a televised attempt to synchronize two incompatible histories, turning a closed-door diplomatic encounter into a shared cultural artifact. Higashi's work in bridging these divides was a precursor to his later career as a professor at Sophia University and a peacebuilding expert for the United Nations. By reconstructing these sessions for a global audience, the NHK project transformed the participants from mere former officials into witnesses for a public that was still struggling to process the trauma of the conflict. A crucial, often overlooked prerequisite for this meeting was the publication of a Vietnamese-language version of Robert McNamara's memoir. While his 1995 admission that the war was terribly wrong served as the initial catalyst, the availability of his arguments in the language of his former adversaries was the major architecture of the dialogue. It allowed the Vietnamese delegation to move beyond the headlines of American contrition and engage with the specific systemic logic that had driven the escalation. This translated text provided a common, if contested, ground upon which the two sides could stand. Its symbolic weight was further enhanced by a unique generational bridge. The Vietnamese edition featured a preface co-authored by McNamara's son, Craig, and General Giap's son, Vo Hong Nam, signaling a move toward reconciliation that extended beyond the original architects of the war. It ensured that when the participants finally gathered at the Metropole Hotel, they were not speaking into a vacuum, but were responding to a set of documented claims that had already been digested by the Vietnamese political and intellectual establishment. The sessions themselves, held in the storied halls of the Metropole Hotel, involved 17 hours of intense discussion over the course of 4 days. They were haunted by the symbolic weight of the 1995 handshake between McNamara and General Vo Nguyen Giap. While that handshake provided the necessary diplomatic cover, the 1997 dialogue was where the real friction of reconciliation occurred. The atmosphere in the hotel was one of clinical intensity, a sharp contrast to the battlefield violence that the participants were there to analyze. This setting functioned as a neutral vessel for a process that was anything but neutral. The Metropole, with its colonial history and its role as a witness to the changing tides of Vietnamese sovereignty, provided a sociological backdrop that reminded the participants of the long arc of history they were attempting to reconcile. This friction was most visible in the asymmetry of evidence brought to the table, a divide that highlighted the different ways the two nations processed history. The American delegation represented a civilization of data, arriving with 2 massive files of declassified documents. They operated under the formalist belief that the truth of the war was a puzzle to be solved by cross-referencing memos, cables, and meeting minutes. For the Americans, reconciliation was a matter of correcting the record and identifying the specific data points where the machinery of policy had failed. The Vietnamese delegation, however, functioned as a civilization of memory. They refused to provide internal documents, relying instead on the oral testimony and lived experiences of their participants. This created a unique sociological tension. The Americans were constantly searching for documentary evidence to verify their hypotheses, while the Vietnamese asserted a reality that they felt was self-evident and required no archival validation. Reconciliation, therefore, was not a matter of finding a shared set of facts, but of learning to navigate the gap between the archive and the anecdote. The evolution of the project's title from Missed Opportunities to Argument Without End serves as a specific example of how reconciliation was redefined during the 4 days in Hanoi. Initially, the goal was to find the branch points where the war could have been avoided, a search for consensus on how the tragedy might have been averted. However, as the tapes of the sessions reveal, the participants eventually realized that consensus was an impossible and perhaps even undesirable goal. Reconciliation was found instead in the acknowledgement of disagreement. By renaming the project Argument Without End, the participants accepted that they would never agree on the why or the how of the war, but they could agree to keep talking about it. This shift from a search for answers to a commitment to dialogue is the true legacy of the 1997 meeting. It transformed reconciliation from a destination into a process, suggesting that in the wake of mass violence, the ability to argue civilly is a more significant achievement than the ability to agree. The search for reconciliation was also a race against the biological limits of history. Nguyen County Thach, a central figure in the secret negotiations and a key voice in the 1997 sessions, died shortly after the dialogue concluded. His absence during Higashi's follow-up interviews adds a layer of lost history to the theme of reconciliation. It highlights the fragility of the process. As the primary actors pass away, the opportunity for this specific type of human-to-human reconciliation closes. The dialogue was a final attempt to capture the memory of the participants before it was replaced entirely by the data of the historians. Thach's death served as a poignant reminder that the window for reconciling with the past is narrow, and that the truth of a conflict is often buried with those who directed it. Finally, the sociological dimension of the meeting was shaped by the divergent goals of the two nations. While the Americans were engaged in a project of psychological and historical clarification, the Vietnamese side maintained a pragmatic focus. For Hanoi, the dialogue was a necessary piece of political theater required to facilitate the broader goals of economic normalization and the Doi Moi reforms. This suggests that reconciliation is often achieved not because two sides finally understand each other's past, but because they find a way to use the past to serve their different futures. The 1997 dialogue proved that while the civilization of data and the civilization of memory might never produce a unified history, they could produce a shared map of their mutual misunderstanding, allowing both nations to finally turn their backs on the battlefield. This realization raises a fundamental question for future conflicts. Can genuine reconciliation ever occur without the pragmatic pressure of a shared economic future? The intellectual architecture of the 1997 Hanoi Dialogue was built upon a technocratic faith in conflict management, a belief that war is a series of calibrated steps that can be signaled and de-escalated through rational bargaining. This framework, the hallmark of the best and brightest, was ultimately revealed to be the primary engine of the war's expansion. When we examine the contemporary landscape of the Middle East, specifically the volatile triangle between the United States, Israel, and Iran, we see the same structural defects in decision-making, the same psychological mirror imaging, and the same sociological insularity that led to the terribly wrong decisions of the Vietnam era. The danger of mutual ignorance is not a historical relic. It is the defining characteristic of modern regional confrontation. The most critical point of comparison lies in the proxy fallacy, a structuralist misreading of command and control that the Hanoi Dialogue exposed.
As established in the misreading of the Pleiku incident, where a local initiative was mistaken for a central command, the American leadership operated under the assumption that every act of violence was a strategic signal sent from a central headquarters. This identical fallacy dominates the modern Western and Israeli perception of the axis of resistance. When groups like the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon launch attacks, there is an immediate reflexive tendency in Washington and Tel Aviv to view these actions as direct orders from the supreme leader in Tehran. This mirror imaging projects a Western bureaucratic understanding of military hierarchy onto a complex, decentralized network of regional actors who possess their own local agendas and tactical autonomy. By ignoring the degree of local initiative, the modern superpower risks launching punishment strikes against a central state for actions it may not have authorized, thereby triggering a total war based on a false premise of centralized intent.
This misapprehension is compounded by a modern obsession with quantitative metrics that mirrors the Vietnam-era body count. During the 1960s, the U.S. relied on statistical data as a measure of success, a technocratic substitute for understanding the enemy's sociological resilience. Today, this manifests as a reliance on surgical strike metrics or decapitation statistics. The belief that killing a specific number of commanders or destroying a certain percentage of infrastructure will lead to a breaking point ignores the reality that these movements are often horizontally organized and ideologically driven. Just as the body count failed to account for the Vietnamese commitment to existential sovereignty, modern surgical metrics fail to account for the way targeted strikes can actually radicalize a population and strengthen the resolve of decentralized paramilitary groups. The psychological framework of punishment logic provides another sobering parallel. McNamara's strategy was predicated on the belief that the North Vietnamese were rational actors who would eventually reach a breaking point if the cost of the war was made high enough, a logic best illustrated by his million lives question. This same logic is visible in the modern use of maximum pressure campaigns and economic sanctions against Iran. The assumption is that Tehran will eventually perform a rational cost-benefit analysis and change its behavior. However, the Hanoi dialogue suggests that for a regime that views itself as engaged in a struggle for national or ideological survival, the Western concept of rationality is irrelevant. The more pressure is applied, the more the target perceives the conflict as existential, justifying further asymmetric responses.
Furthermore, the dialogue reveals a central tension between economic pragmatism and revolutionary ideology that is mirrored in modern Tehran. Tran Quan County viewed the Hanoi dialogue not just as a historical postmortem, but as a pragmatic path toward economic development and integration with the West. He recognized that for Vietnam to thrive, it had to move beyond the revolutionary struggle and toward economic pragmatism. This provides a perfect parallel to the internal struggle within the Iranian state, where the pragmatic need for sanctions relief and economic integration constantly clashes with the revolutionary ideology of the hardliners. The U.S. often fails to exploit this internal tension, instead treating the Iranian state as a monolithic ideological bloc, much as it treated the Vietnamese Politburo.
The sociological dimension of the Tuesday lunch meeting finds its modern equivalent in the insularity of contemporary policy echo chambers. The exclusion of experts on regional history and culture in favor of abstract theories of containment or great power competition creates a vicious cycle of distrust. In this environment, every action taken by the enemy is interpreted through a lens of inherent bad faith. This dynamic has plagued modern efforts at de-escalation, such as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. Just as the 1962 Geneva Accords on Laos were viewed by the U.S. as a failed experiment in trust, the JCPOA is often viewed not as a missed opportunity for stability, but as a deceptive tactic by Tehran. The Hanoi dialogue revealed that in the absence of trust, even minimum conditions that are technically compatible on paper cannot be acted upon. The best and brightest of today are often blind to the fact that their own mindsets make peace impossible, regardless of the data. This blindness is exacerbated by a profound civilizational misperception. During the 1960s, the Vietnamese saw the U.S. as the new France, a successor to the colonial power they had just defeated. In the modern Middle East, a similar perception persists, where Israel and the U.S. are viewed as neo-colonial entities, regardless of their stated defensive intentions. When the U.S. deploys carrier strike groups as deterrent signals, it intends to communicate resolve and prevent escalation. However, through the lens of the New France misperception, these signals are interpreted as imperialist provocations that necessitate an escalatory response to maintain regional credibility. What the U.S. sees as crisis management, the regional target sees as hegemonic aggression. The linguistic gap between negotiation and discussion also persists in the modern Iran-U.S. conflict. The U.S. approaches conflict through the lens of transactional bargaining, seeking to trade points to reach a middle ground. Iran and its allies, conversely, frame their actions as part of a revolutionary struggle against arrogance. When one side is talking about concessions and the other is talking about sovereignty and justice, they are not just disagreeing on terms. They are using the same words to describe entirely different realities. The missed opportunities of the Vietnam War were the result of two sides speaking different political languages, a phenomenon that continues to undermine modern diplomacy. The warning issued by Tran Quang Ko, "Do not be overconfident, do not be arrogant," strikes at the heart of the modern escalatory danger. The intellectual arrogance of the 1960s led to the misreading of local initiatives and the belief that bombing could extort peace. In the current Iran-U.S.-Israel conflict, this arrogance manifests as a refusal to engage with the genuine security fears and historical grievances of the adversary. The Western framework assumes its own intentions are defensive, while the adversaries are aggressive. The Hanoi dialogue revealed that this asymmetry is a delusion. The U.S. and Israel may be as ignorant of the specific internal pressures and defensive calculations that drive Iranian policy as the Johnson administration was of the nationalist drivers in Hanoi. The structural choice of the Tuesday lunch meeting also highlights the danger of centralizing power among a small group of advisors who prioritize consensus over dissent. In the modern context, the rapid pace of digital communication and the 24-hour news cycle have only increased the pressure on leaders to make quick, decisive signals during a crisis. This environment favors punishment logic and mirror imaging. The Hanoi dialogue proved that the best and brightest are most dangerous when they are most certain. The revelation that the minimum conditions for peace were compatible as early as the mid-1960s is a haunting reminder that millions died not because of a clash of interests, but because of a clash of certainties. Ultimately, the comparison between the missed opportunities of Vietnam and the modern escalatory dynamics in the Middle East reveals a recurring tragedy of human reason. The best and brightest are not those who possess the most data, but those who possess the intellectual humility to admit what they do not know. The 1997 Hanoi dialogue was a confrontation with the consequences of that missing humility. It showed that when a superpower treats a complex, decentralized regional struggle as a monolithic ideological domino, it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of total war.
As the modern world navigates the precarious escalation ladders of the 21st century, the question remains, can the vicious cycle of distrust be broken by data alone, or does it require a fundamental shift in the very thought climate that defines the enemy?
The sharpest insight of the Hanoi dialogue is the revelation that the war was not a clash of irreconcilable interests, but a catastrophic failure of intelligence, where compatible minimum conditions for peace existed as early as the mid-1960s, yet remained invisible behind a vicious cycle of distrust. It suggests that the best and brightest did not fail for lack of data, but for a lack of the intellectual humility required to see past their own models. If even compatible goals can produce a total war when filtered through mutual ignorance, can any amount of transparency ever bridge a civilizational gap? Or is trust a prerequisite for knowledge that we are still fundamentally unequipped to build? Thank you for engaging with this analysis. We invite you to share your own interpretation of these historical tapes in the comments as we continue to weigh the limits of rational policy together.